Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Arts First podcast. My name is Wendy Earle, and with me, as usual, is my collaborator, Niall Crowley. In this episode, we discuss art education. I've long wanted to do something on this subject, but have found it difficult to decide how to focus the discussion. It's a huge subject ranging from teaching school children art to the work of art schools in the development of artists and designers, and much more. To kick off this discussion, which Art First will return to in due course, I hope, I thought we could focus on the development of young artists and consider how art education, or more specifically art schools, work towards this end. But calling this a focus is a bit misleading because it's a huge subject. Art schools train young artists and foster their talent, creativity, and inspiration. The curriculum ranges across fine art, various art, crafts and design, in theory and in practice. And arguably, there is a duality with the process of art education. To justify their existence, at least in terms of funding, art schools may feel the need to highlight their use value. So, for example, the Royal College of Art currently celebrates, at the top of its website, being winner in a Global Design for Betterment Challenge. And it's a fact that art schools, via the artists and designers they train, probably contribute to the quality of our daily lives in ways that most of us just take for granted, in the design of our environs, our clothes, our machines, and many of the things that we see and use. But what about the role of art schools in the development of non-useful art, fine arts, painting and sculpture and the like, art for art's sake, high art, frivolous art, even socially engaged art? Our contributors to this discussion have direct and varied experience of art education, and I'm extremely grateful to you all for agreeing to participate in this tentative investigative ramble into the world of art education. I must apologise for throwing you such a broad challenge with only vague directions on questions to address. We're going to start with brief snapshots of experiences of teaching and or studying art, from which we might extrapolate some of the issues at stake. We're not expecting to resolve the issues, of course, but maybe to clarify them a little. So I'm going to briefly introduce each of you just before you speak. And the first speaker is Gregor Claude, art teacher at Cooper's Company in Coburn School in Upminster, who I've asked to tell us a bit about the main principles he follows in teaching art at A-level as a possible springboard for aspiring artists into art school, getting into art school. So, Gregor.
All right. Well, thank you, Wendy. And I'll just to clarify to start, I teach the full range of secondary school. So the youngest students are 11 years old and the oldest are A-level students at 18. And I'm going to I'll probably end up not talking loads about the some of the specifics of say A-level. But I want to start by setting the bar high with a quote from John Ruskin, the art critic, 19th century art critic, who wrote, "The teaching of art is the teaching of all things." And it's one of the things that I love about teaching art at whatever age range I'm engaging with. It's really about different elements of human thought and feeling and hope and understanding, as well as aesthetics. And I wanted to start by framing the way that I see education as a kind of humanist approach. We teachers in schools, part of what I think we ought to be doing is recognizing that being human is an adventure, and what we can do, hopefully, is with education, is to invite our students to participate in that adventure. So what does that mean? What does that mean? Offering that invitation for art education in schools? Well, here's what it doesn't mean. It doesn't mean instrumentalization. It doesn't mean using some kind of external justification for art education. And that instrumentalization, I think, has always haunted education, certainly mass education. Whether it's in, you're all familiar, I'm sure, with the familiar critique of mass education as teaching, above all, how to be disciplined and how to be a good factory worker by keeping time to schedule and that kind of thing. Or more recently, training future knowledge workers, or you could even say more recent instrumentalizations of art education around things like teaching art to be therapeutic, or to be inclusive, or to provide a way into the creative industries. Now, those, I think, are often quite valuable things to take account of, but too often they are seen as the kind of the key core justification for what art education ought to be doing. So I kind of see teaching in art in schools as involving a certain kind of smuggling. There are border guards, there are border patrols, and they're going to check for whatever particular justification they think you ought to be doing. And you want to be able to show them the right papers, but you also want to be able to do the really interesting kind of big picture stuff. So what does that mean in art education? And I'm going to, just to open up the discussion, I'm going to start with a very oversimplified answer. But I would say that across the ages that I teach, what that answer is it's learning how to see and learning how to think about what you see. Close looking, I think, is core to what I try and do, whether it's with an 11-year-old or an 18-year-old. And that looks different at those different ages. Learning how to see things that you didn't previously know were there, whether it's shape and light and form and color. Learning to see things that you didn't know artists were doing, like composition. What young students don't realize the kinds of decision processes that go into the way that artists present their work and arrange and structure their work and develop their work. So learning that is absolutely key. When I first started teaching art about 12 years ago, I came across a psychology study that had a really big impact on me. Apparently, at about the age of 10 or 11, the young brain is beginning to see things and beginning to be able to understand things in a way that they hadn't been able to as kids. Almost all kids draw. And then at around this age, you begin to look at your drawings and think, that's not what a person looks like. There are no stick people. Houses aren't a triangle with a box below it. And so you try and draw something more realistically, whether it's a face or a tree or whatever. And very often those students will fail and they conclude that they're not artists. And that's it, right? That's for somebody else to do. And there's probably somebody else in the room who is pretty good at drawing, and you just don't quite get why. Now, a good art education helps a student to bridge that gap between their developing brains, what they're able to think about, how they're able to think about what they see, and how they're able to use that knowledge and that developing ability to produce something interesting. So I'll wrap up a little bit by describing our first project that we do with our 11-year-olds in year 7. And it's one of the technically most challenging projects that we do. And it's a still life project. We, day one, put a bunch of objects in front of them. And without any instruction, we say, draw this. Then we teach them how to look at things. We teach them how to think about proportion, positioning, negative space, tone. And then a couple of months later, they do a final piece and they can see the improvement that they've made. And entirely through that time, I'm trying to convince them that by thinking about what they see, they can develop their artistic abilities. Now, some go on to decide that that's what they want to do more seriously at GCSE or A level, and some don't. But hopefully by the end of year 9, before kids take GCSE, they have some appreciation of what it is to have an aesthetic mode of engaging with the world, what it is to think about what you see, what it is to develop an ability to understand artwork, to develop an ability to analyze and judge artwork. And certainly in later years, one of the key things is really developing the ability to have an extended investigation into the process of a visual investigation. I think if we can do that, and if we can along the way be the kind of mentors that help people see more than they thought they could, then that's a half decent art education.
That's great. Thanks. That's a really good start, Gregor. Thank you. Okay, so our next speaker is Eliza Bonham Carter. And Eliza is an artist herself, but also head of Royal Academy Schools. And she works at really the other end, I suppose, the sort of like once an artist, a young person is committed to their vocation as an artist, taking them forward into the career of an artist. So, Eliza, do you want to pick up from there?
Thank you. And thank you, Gregor. I was thinking today myself about paying attention and how the act of paying attention continues to be the most critical thing an artist can do at any time of their life. And that the act of paying attention can be to many things. It doesn't need necessarily to be the visual world. It could be to a text or other information. But that as an artist progresses through an educational line, that need to keep that alertness to what's in front of you is absolutely vital. The Royal Academy Schools is a postgraduate programme. So we are working with students who are already absolutely committed to having a life in art. And it's our intention to provide the means by which they can develop their practice as artists, in order that can be sustainable through the rest of their lives, a life in art. And it's important to distinguish that, what that might be, and it might be very different things for different people. It might be that you become a teacher and contribute to cultural life in that way, or an artist with an international exhibition profile, or a writer or a curator. There are so many ways in which people who go through art education end up contributing to how we live. Wendy, you mentioned at the opening about the fact that we're surrounded by things designed and made by people who have gone through art school. But I also find a lot of people who've gone through undergraduate programs end up being the most brilliant TV producers. The thing about an art education is that it provides you with incredible capacity to project manage yourself, to be self-motivated, to work your way through disaster and failure, and find in that failure actually possibly something better than you intended in the first place. The difference between having a kind of fixed intention and being open to what happens along the way. The fact that using materials is actually an intellectual activity. It's not an activity that then needs to be only exists once it's been dissected. An artwork in itself is a form of an essay. And I think that there can be a lot of confusion about that, about what needs to go with the artwork in order for it to be understood and recognised. But at the school, working as we do with these older student artists, the average age is about 28. Most of them have done an undergraduate programme in fine art. Most of them will have had time out. We recommend that so that they bring this diverse experience with them. The things that we think are really vital for those students in all of their diversity, and we seek that diversity, is time and space, access to the development of skills, and access to the library, to critical discussion, where criticality is a kind of generous intellectual activity. It's not a form of criticism. And that we really place a lot of stead by the conversations that we can have around art and about art. So we seek kind of all the way from the most formal lecture to the tutorial to the group critique, all the way to eating or drinking and talking about art. So the least formal and the most formal, the incidental and the highly planned. I think a postgraduate art school should be like a bird table. I think it should be able to sustain the artists who like to stick to the ground and peck around at what's fallen from above, the ones who can do the acrobatic hijinks off the feeder. And I think that what you want to provide is this opportunity for people to have time to pay attention to what they need as an artist rather than what they're told artists need. And that period of time to develop their understanding of their own personal approach rather than approaches that have been kind of instilled in them through academic or other structures is really important. And that's what I hope our students leave with maybe I should stop there.
Well, that was really interesting. I looked at the RA School's website and the curriculum. I just thought, oh, if only, start my life again. There was so much in it that I felt was very promising.
What I probably should have said is that we have extraordinary conditions that can't be replicated. They, as an institution, we were founded in 1768 to create a school of art, and we're independent. We're not validated by the Office for Students. We don't charge fees to students. We manage to find amazing people who support the school. And we have very small cohorts, and we have fantastic workshops providing skills. So we're an outlier, but I think we're a very useful outlier as a point of reference. And I'm always in awe of my colleagues in the public sector who do extraordinary things with less auspicious circumstances.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Right, so next we have 3 people who've studied variously from art at school, and now we've got Eliza Friend and Tacita Twaddle, who are both pursuing foundation courses at the moment and are thinking about their future in art and how and if they're going to pursue it. And Anna Keenan, who is a recent graduate of art history and English literature degree. And I asked Anna to join us because though she's not gone through art school, I feel like her course in art history might inform a little bit about how she sees the creation of art from an outside point of view, which is a little bit closer to, say, myself. So I'll ask you each in turn to say something, and then we'll move on to Niall and Colin, who were once, quite a long time ago, students. Tacita, would you like to start off?
Yeah, I can start. I think that we're speaking from quite a different perspective from other people who are speaking about art, because Eliza and I are both right at the beginning, because I think that the way that art is taught in schools is taught very differently to at a post-school level. And I think that it's quite an interesting shift on foundation, because it changes from what was more about quite a quantifiable and quite a often technical way of teaching, as you were speaking about still lifes, into something that does step more into the more demanding and conceptual and academic side of things, which is interesting. But I also think that it can be difficult and is more sort of centered towards how someone pursuing art can sort of have a place in the world vocationally, but also just people doing art as their sole pursuit rather than as within A-level and GCSE, which is often part of lots of other different things. And I think that it's quite difficult with the system in this country. You're forced to narrow it down and choose quite quickly. And I think that having a more multifaceted approach to art and thinking about it as not only art, but also how other subjects and other disciplines feed into it and inform your work is still something that's quite important and is maybe not focused enough on the foundation course. Maybe I think that it steps into it quite quickly, and I think that'll be an interesting thing to think about.
So it's really interesting what everyone said, I think, about the looking and the seeing, and how that is the foundation of our education, and that makes a lot of sense to me. But as Wendy said, I'm not an artist. Actually, I hate to say it, Gregor, but GCSE art really put me off studying art, because it was, as Eliza said, it was very granular and technical, and it was I really felt that it squashed my originality. So I parked it, I didn't do it. And then I realised that I wanted to study the history of art when I was 18, after a very amazing trip to Vienna. It just sort of opened my eyes to art. And I studied it, but purely for the love of studying it. And I think it gave me that idea of criticality that Eliza spoke so well about previously. However, for me, it was very much grounded in the desire to understand history. And I think it's only now that I look back, I realised that what I was really studying was history rather than art itself. And obviously they were extremely intertwined. but the humanities as a collective are so present in the study of history of art. And of course, I also did English literature, and I also studied philosophy for a period of time at university. So for me, those are all extremely integrated pursuits. And I think that studying the history of art was a really wonderful grounding point for me to be able to understand all of those things intersecting. And I can't speak to how well those are, that is delivered in art courses, but it sounds like maybe from what Eliza said, there's maybe a lack of that, because for me it unlocked so much of the connections between ideas and that sort of humanist perspective. But I also think it's worth potentially discussing the current limitations in art education, because I was in a very fortunate position where I knew that for me it was just for the love of it. So doing a joint honours and doing English literature, I always knew that I was going to become an English teacher, which is my current career. And it was really fortunate that I could just study art history because I loved it. But I also had English because I knew I was going to be an English teacher. So when I sort of figured out that combination, it was like a light bulb moment, and it was really positive. But many of my classmates who didn't go into what I did then had to pursue further education, postgraduate education, museum education, curation, whatever it might be, which is really positive for them. But I know it's been quite a slog, I would say, or quite a difficult industry to break into. So I guess my main point and my main belief is that studying art from the more academic side of things and the historical side of things is so valuable for how you perceive the world and how you make references and links between things. And I think for me, it's given me such a basis for understanding different cultures or different places that I go to, or books that I read, or any sort of thing that is in the cultural forum in life. But that has its limitations when it comes to a study, because not everyone can just do it and say, right, that's what I love and that's me, and I'll somehow go and find a job, because it's not that simple to turn that into a career and a skill, when a lot of the industry, I think, requires a lot more than just studying it because you love it.
I think that's a useful point, because I think one of the bigger questions that I'm interested in is the relationship between artists and the people who will see art and enjoy art, and how we encourage that to happen, and whether it's really happening enough. I mean, that is one of the, I guess, a crisis of art education, is that not enough people take it to the point that even to really understand what they might be looking at and what art actually is. So next we've got the two voices from the past, as I've called them, and we've got Colin Searles, who went to art school in the 1970s and experienced some of the changes prompted by the art student revolution in the 1960s, and Niall Crowley himself, who attended art school, I think, in the 1980s, studying design. And I've asked them to just maybe reflect on the changes that have happened, they've observed in art education since they themselves were art students. And Colin has continued to work in art education himself at university level. So I'm quite interested in their insights and that. And while they're talking, if people would like to sort of just, think maybe about what questions are coming out of what you've heard so far, and we can then move on to a questioning or responding where people can comment on the issues that seem to be emerging from what people are saying. But anyway, Colin, take it away.
So one thing that did strike me was that in connecting what was being put forward by Gregor and Eliza, which was from A-level education through to postgraduate education, the absolutely formative, critical role that a foundation program fulfills. And I think certainly since the 1970s, the role of foundation has been really pivotal in art and design education. And it's an interesting feature of art and design. We have two bedfellows, or two conjoined disciplines that work and very closely together and share a lot of attributes and traits, but actually are properly quite distinguished and quite different in what they ask of students. And I think the 1 year, and in some cases 2 year foundation programs, and we have obviously 2 students with us who personify that, give students an opportunity to really explore, test, experiment against the different disciplines that are potentially on offer within art and design. And I think that's a really interesting feature. It quite often, when you talk to students who've been through an art and design experience, an art and design education, they will talk about the formative nature of the foundation program that they benefited from, because there's an opening up from the skills and close looking that perhaps is encouraged at A level, a kind of opportunity to value improvisation, to test yourself against different kinds of discipline specific skills. And if we think about it in a kind of circle, we have probably, if we put fine art at the top, we don't want to be prejudiced, and put design at the lower portion. And then we have kind of the different dimensions. We might have 2 dimensions, 3 dimensions, 4 dimensions. And students are, I think, challenged to explore those modalities and those discipline specific opportunities across a foundation year. And quite often, in wrestling with that, they come to a kind of self-realization as to where their motivations, their independent skills best take them forward. I don't know if that's been the experience of students so far on the foundation courses, but I do think that's a kind of key stage in art and design education that I think we should cherish.
Yes, thanks for that. That's a useful way of just thinking about why the foundation course is perhaps particularly important and should should remain part of any kind of art education process for somebody who wants to transition into or make that decision about their future. Because I think certainly from what Eliza Bonham Carter was saying earlier, it is a major commitment. And I mean, I dabble, and I know it's a discipline. You have to learn to apply yourself, and if you don't learn that application and independence, then it's something that maybe it's not for you. So Niall, your turn. Do you want to come in with your own experience and how you see things these?
I just second what you said. If you don't put in the commitment, you don't get anywhere, which is probably my experience in art. But I studied, did my foundation at Wolverhampton, which actually is under threat of closure at the moment. But that was back in the 80s. It was absolutely formative and a real experience for me. I did an A-level art, which I was reminded of when Gregor mentioned factories, because I come from a very kind of post-industrial area in the Midlands, and I remember my A-level art teacher being quite tough on me one time, saying, because I hadn't actually done any work, saying I was better off going to work in a factory. So and she was right, and I think that you don't get that kind of kind of toughness so much, certainly not very direct toughness in schools. I work in a school at the moment. It was great, and I think, like Colin said, it was and others. It's you get a very good broad experience of sculpture, painting, photography, drawing, and there are great opportunities there. I was kind of fortunate or unfortunate enough to be the art school was closed when I was there for building problems, and we were shipped out every day to the middle of the Staffordshire countryside to a former stately home that had been stripped bare by the National Coal Board in the 50s. So, but it was a great kind of working environment. But I didn't put the work in. I was just a bit lost at the time, and I thought I could get into St. Martin's, and I absolutely didn't. So I then went into the industry, worked in print and design, and slipped into desktop publishing, which was just coming about at the time. So for me, what started out as a kind of a creative journey became something very technical and boring. So about 10 years later, I was always interested in art history. So interesting kind of bridge with Anna. I think I probably discovered a similar thing, but it took me much longer to realize that probably my interest was history. So I went to Brighton and I did history of design, material culture, architecture, which, as I say, I'd always been interested in, and that was attached to Brighton School of Art. So it's quite interesting being part of that. But that was in the 90s, and I found it a little bit disappointing. It wasn't academically very challenging. And at the time, it was, I think, like art history at the time, it was changing a lot. There were lots of, it was very fashionable to deconstruct everything, and, you know, postmodernist ideas were very, it was like a very dumbed down cultural studies course, if you like. So I found it a little bit unsatisfying. So I drifted away from that. But like I say, interesting listening to Anna. I think probably at the end of the day, it's taken me a few decades to decide that probably history is my interest. But yeah, I think it was an interesting, good, all round education and experience, and I'm very, like Wendy, I'm very envious of anyone who has that opportunity now. Just to finish, I work for an academy chain, so I'm not a teacher, but I do go to different schools, and I'm constantly pleasantly surprised by how well resourced many of our schools are. I see studios and classrooms and great teachers. And we've had discussions at Art First about what's happening. Well, and there's lots of discussions about what's happening in the arts and funding and everything, and students not going into the arts. So for me, there was always this kind of contradiction. I look at schools and I think things are great, things are doing really well, especially compared to when I was there. So what's going on? Is there a contradiction between what's going on at the university level and what's going on in schools?
Okay, thanks. So I suppose I'd quite like to bring in Eliza Bonham Carter and Gregor, just to come back maybe on some with thoughts about what has been said since they first spoke, and maybe we could start exploring some of the kind of key challenges for art schools at this present moment, because the there is that I suppose that kind of funneling process. I don't know if that's a good word to use, but funneling from the idea of possibly not enough students taking art at school, but then the fact is that having a career in the arts is a real option, but being an artist, as in devoted 100% to creating your own individual work, is a huge thing for any individual to take on. So just I don't know what your thoughts are in relation to those kind of issues, or any others. So yeah, who would like to speak first?
I'd really love to hear Gregor talk about art education in the state sector now, because you read statistics and they don't sound good. But as Niall says, he's seeing something different. Is there hope, Gregor?
Thanks for that. I think if there wasn't hope, then I'd find something else to do. Talking about hope, I'm a former academic, and so many people that I know from when I was working in universities have just really struggled to make a life in universities. So just from one point of view, actually being able to have a job and teach in, as you say, Niall, a relatively well-resourced situation, there's certainly hope there. I think that there's definitely also an important element in which funding across the board is more and more difficult to maintain. There's all kinds of squeezes that happen, but I think that in terms of the big picture of education and arts education, in terms of things like resources, we're in a kind of drifting moment. There doesn't seem to be a particular drive to squeeze out the arts as much as there had been maybe at the high water mark of, say, the kind of STEM drive, science, technology, and engineering and math. Have I got that right? So that seems to have receded a little bit. There's probably all kinds of interesting reasons why. When all of a sudden a computer can spit out code, perhaps there's some people who have regretted their career choices and maybe wish they had done something a little bit more humanistic and creative. So I think that on the one hand, there's a drive towards a real squeeze in terms of funding. On the other hand, I don't think that there's a particular concerted effort to replace it with anything else. So there's this kind of almost zombie continuing on, rambling and shambling on. And one of the things that I really noticed, so I'm in addition to being a teacher at my school, I'm a moderator for some of the exam boards. So I go to other schools and I look at their A-level work, their GCSE work, and it really gives a big picture of a wider picture of situations in different schools. And in my school, I feel very fortunate to be relatively well supported by the administration, and that is not the case in other schools. So I think that the condition in schools is very granular. It's some schools, some state sector schools are doing really well. Other state sector schools are in situations where, you know, the head or the leadership team doesn't understand what art does and wish they would do less of it and find ways of pushing them and marginalizing to the side. So it's mixed, but I want to come back to the idea of, like, part of what I feel like I'm doing is smuggling operation. It's finding a way of doing the interesting things given the constraints, and as you say, Niall, some of our resources are pretty good. I could definitely make a case for a lot more. You know, give me a budget and I'll figure out how to use it for sure. But yeah, just in terms of that, I've got lots more to say about some of the other points that people have made, but I've been talking for a little while, so I'll stop and pass over.
I thought I'd just ask you, Eliza Friend, because just the points about the idea of art as a vocation, and you wanting to move in, I think your direction of work is to go into the fashion industry. And I was wondering why you, coming out of art at A-level and going into foundation, what was your thought process about thinking, okay, I'm going to do fashion? Was it because you feel like that's a job you want to do? Is it because you love fashion more than any other way of doing art?
In art A-level, you didn't really explore different disciplines like architecture and fashion, and even kind of sculpture. It was more painting and drawing for me. And one thing I wanted to look into was architecture and sculpture, and fashion and 4D photography, everything basically. And that's what foundation helped me do. And at the start of our foundation, you do a diagnostic period where you explore all of the different pathways. And I just explored the fashion pathway for a week, and I really, really enjoyed it. And that led me on to specializing in it, which I've now specialized in it for about 2 months, and it was a very, very quick process. Like, by the time I specialized in fashion and textiles, I straight away had to make a portfolio. And so I was making a portfolio, and then I was also doing all of these 2-week lasting projects while still learning how to, like, really design and develop my ideas and everything. But that was the whole idea why I chose fashion. It was just more, I fell in love with it while doing the diagnostic period.
And I suppose that is one of the things about art, is you have to just love it. I mean, Eliza Bonham Carter, was that idea of commitment at the Royal Academy, as opposed to, say, the Royal College of Art, does the Royal College of Art have a specialism towards designers and artists who, in a way, become producers? I'm wondering what you think about that kind of tension between somebody going into fashion, somebody going into fine art, whether that is a false dichotomy that I'm making, or whether there is a sort of a thing about where the pressures come from on young people or people wanting to go into the arts.
Well, just quickly, the Royal College was founded to establish an art school that nurtured design. That's at its heart. It's a school of design. Prince Albert was very involved in that, and fine art was present always at the Royal College, but because it was felt essential to have fine art as a kind of guiding light for designers. There was, as said earlier, a kind of pyramid where, fine art was considered to be the high and design. But kind of lower down the pecking order, which of course I think is a load of rubbish. But the Royal College was absolutely there to create this sort of this body of people who had design educations at their heart. And this, of course, is very connected to the, Industrial Revolution. And it seems to me something that government has forgotten, that actually you need designers, you need artists, both in order to feed thinking about design and feed thinking about fine art. So that was one thing. But you had a second question about which direction you take. I think you find it. I think I would second what everybody has said about Foundation. I think Foundation is such a brilliant program. It is. It's on the whole very different from what I know about A-level. Gregor, I don't want to speak for A-level because I'm far away from it now, apart from my daughter doing it a few years ago. But it is that moment when suddenly you can do art 24 hours a day, and that's what your purpose is. And I think what I witnessed as a Foundation student all those years ago was people just finding their place. And that thing, and again, it goes back to attention. It's about what draws you, what is the thing you can concentrate on for 12 hours rather than getting bored of it after half an hour. What's the thing that you look up from and you realize the day's gone? And I think Foundation is a brilliant program. And also, I think now that we have fees, very expensive degree level education, I think not doing a Foundation is a big risk, because Foundation allows you to test all those things out before you make that decision. And I think there are people who rush straight onto degrees. There's somehow a sense of terrible haste about getting on with your life or something. And I think the longer you take, the better. And a Foundation's a very good stop off.
Tassie, what do you think about that? Did you sort of, are you finding yourself immersed in something you love doing? And actually also bringing in the history of art side of things, I'm quite curious whether you have that as part of your course at all, or whether it's really more about practice and skill.
I think I agree with what everyone said, and I think that it's a really important and formative part of one's art education. But I also think that there is kind of the difficulty of the fact that it is quite quick. So that diagnostic period for us was only 8 weeks, and a lot of disciplines which really you could look at for the rest of your life, you look at in a day. And so it becomes something you've really got to devote yourself to in order to kind of discover what that is that you're interested in. So for me, I didn't actually have that kind of click, this is what I want to do, because it was more that I still wanted to do everything and I still couldn't narrow that down, and I still had such a wide range of interests. So I ended up picking sculpture as a way to kind of try and continue exploring a wide range of things, because sculpture is such a broad medium. It's something that then also your drawings and prints and photography can also come into that and be a part of it. So I kind of felt that that was the way to go for me, but I still haven't really decided where I want to take that afterwards, because I think that I don't know, it's just quite a difficult decision. And because, as we've all said, that degrees are such an expensive commitment, I think finding the right thing is not as straightforward as everyone makes it out to be, as people come straight from school and decide to jump straight into these £30,000, like 3-year courses. And for the history of art question, I don't feel that there is enough as part of the foundation course. I just think because it's such an ambitious course that aims to explore so many things within such a small space of time, it just can't hit all those bases. And sometimes I feel that there are people within my class who maybe, I don't know whether it's because like everyone's had such different art educations up to the point of foundation, whether that's because they've gone to different types of schools, also the fact that 50% of our course comes from international places everywhere, so they don't necessarily have similar backgrounds of A-level and GCSE art, which is slightly more rigorous. I don't really know how it could be taught in other places. And so I think that sometimes there is a slight lack of understanding of the history of art, which, like, how we've come to this point and how,
Yeah.
basically.
I'd be quite interested in hearing from Anna and Colin about that subject of history of art, and whether that should be. I mean, Anna, I suppose to some extent, it's that thing. Your fascination in the history of art was to do with knowledge, and certainly from what Eliza Bonham Carter was saying, is that knowledge is something that kind of is what you do when you are actually practicing the development of your own art. Your work as an artist is part of developing that knowledge. And I wonder whether that, listening to what Eliza Bonham Carter has said about doing art itself, kind of changes your mind a little bit about maybe yourself doing art, or maybe not. And Colin, I wonder how much where you see the idea of that kind of background knowledge of history of art coming in that Eliza was mentioning, because I think that that's also something, a preoccupation I have. I just don't really know how important it is to have as part of certainly sort of early degree level. And I remember being quite shocked a few years ago when Goldsmiths, I think, announced that they were going to stop doing, for their BA course, we're going to stop doing art history before the war, the Second World War. So art history was going to become quite a shallow subject in some ways. Anyway, your thoughts on that question, interesting.
I'm happy to start. So, sorry, Colin. It's interesting to me what you're saying about the lack of focus on history of art, because I found when I was doing my degree, I had a sort of imposter syndrome of, well, I'm not an artist, so why is this even relevant to me? And maybe on the flip side, someone who is an artist and doesn't have an artistical background might feel a bit of similar imposter syndrome of, I don't know anything about the history of art, so where am I starting from? What am I building on, or what am I taking forward in my own practice? So my instinct, as I think a lot of us have mentioned, is that surely the history of art has to be fundamental to art education in terms of a basis for where your work from, what you're building upon, and what your practice means in the context of history, world, how to make decisions. And I'm sure that Gregor can relate. Being a teacher, a year is a very short time, and to decide what to teach in that time it keeps you up at night. What do I pick? What do I teach? What do I want to instill in these young people? And that goes for humanities, I would say, whether that be English or art, because if you appreciate art and you appreciate culture, then any of those elements of history are arguably indispensable to giving that sort of linear understanding of the progression of history and of art. So it's very tricky to make those choices, but I do get the impression that there needs to be more of an emphasis on that to equip young people with starting point. And I know I don't want to make this about English and literature, but it's exactly how I think about teaching English as well, because there's been a shift towards more contemporary text, I would say, especially I work in Scotland, and I would say that, kind of what you mentioned about Goldsmiths, maybe there's a desire to meet students where they are and to feel their interest like that. And I find that quite difficult because I want to teach them what the basics of English literature study is, which is the historical text, but it's very hard to pinpoint and divide and make choices about those things.
When we were putting together creative programs in the 80s and 90s, we had a slightly flippant rubric, which was informed by the past, responding to the present to create the future. So there was that kind of sense of that momentum, but it had to be grounded, it had to be located. Although, there were always questions about where the anchor points were and how firm they were. I think the other thing, though, that I feel we could do with just touching on is the whole area of learning by doing. And I think it's been touched on, but I do think it's a really important feature of art and design education. And the other thing, which I think Eliza has mentioned, possibly both Elizas actually, is the capacity for students, or the encouragement for students, to actually negotiate and navigate the syllabus to make sense of it for themselves. And I think that sense of independent reflection by that navigation is a real feature of a thriving art and design education. And the final thing is that I think perhaps alongside performance disciplines, we have a capacity to work with collaborative assessments. I mean, I think we've heard about the crit, the group crit. And I think, again, that's a real feature, that sense of actually peer group learning, which happens in ways that is sometimes very surprising. But it is a real feature of art and design provision, I think.
I can't second what you say more. I think that the part of attention, giving attention, is learning by making. It's paying attention to what's happening. You set off with an idea, but as you're making it, you're seeing actually how the materials respond, and how that idea might change and mutate as a result of your processes. And that's, I guess, so fundamental to how artists think. But also that a lot of artists are brilliant autodidacts. They learn how to learn. And I think that the best kind of art school teaching is facilitating young artists to find out how to find out for themselves. But you need to have some bearings in order to do that. Both the practice of it is something that needs to be practiced in an educational setting, but also some approaches and methodologies that you can veer away from or use is also incredibly important. I guess, using the word methodology, I think I also see methodologies used in a kind of quite oppressive way in some cases, in some art education sectors or situations, and because they become like a rubric, that if you don't do it this way, then you're not really making art the right way. And I don't think there is one way to make art. I think it's your way of making art, and that's what I hope artists learn in the process.
And would you say risk taking? Because I sort of feel like one of the reasons why I never became an artist was because I hated taking risks and wasn't really encouraged to in the early stages of my youthful enthusiasm.
You can't make art without taking risks. You can't. It has to be about that. Scraping expensive paint off a canvas and putting it back on again, or finding a way of rebuilding something that's collapsed, or doing something where you don't know the outcome. And I think that, there's a really interesting writer on art pedagogy called Darren Raven, who talks about pondering and the importance of pondering, that you're thinking through something that doesn't have a known outcome.
Great. So any final comments from anybody? Just sort of wrapping up.
I've got one, which is that we have. I mean, it doesn't flow necessarily with what we've been discussing, but I think the importance of art, particularly in art school, as a place that people who have different ways of thinking can find their place and find their purpose. And I think the kind of the undermining of art in schools, and particularly maybe both, is really problematic, because there are people who are brilliantly clever but who aren't going to fit the academic mold. And if you don't provide really strong access to the arts where those people can flourish, they're in a very miserable place for a very big part of formative years of their life. And it's not a clever way to think about education. It has to be a broad diet. Like our food, we need the breadth of diet in education to support those different thinkers.
Yes, I was quite interested in an article that Colin sent me about Brighton's kind of recreation of itself, I think, in the early late 60s. My timing on these things is terrible, but that idea that of foundation courses, people having to qualify through certain measures, but also teachers in recruiting students to their course also being able to break the rules about what students you recruit. So you also recruit students who haven't ticked all the boxes, because sometimes the talents of an artist can't be measured through an examination or something like that. And in fact, making the comment that many of those, there tends to be a greater proportion of successful graduates into the arts from students who hadn't necessarily been great at school, following the rules at school. So yeah, just interesting. Okay, well, I think probably we have to wrap up there, but I've really enjoyed listening to everything all of you have said. It's been a real learning experience for me. So I'm very grateful for you all participating. And I do feel like it raises discussions that we hopefully will come back to, because it's such a big topic. And I think what Eliza was saying about it, it's gone so much onto the back burner as far as government education policy is concerned, at least in government policy in general, a complete lack of appreciation of both what the arts are, in and of themselves, and also how they contribute in ways that we can't really foretell. And that's the big frustration, isn't it?